Verbs with prefixes in German are base verbs combined with a prefix. The prefix can change the meaning of a base verb and affect how it's conjugated and placed in a sentence. In German, there are three types: separable, inseparable, and mixed. Separable prefixes separate from the verb when conjugated in the present tense, and the separated prefix usually appears at the end of a sentence. Common separable prefixes are ab, an, auf, aus, bei, ein, fort, in, los, mit, nach, and vor. Before showing examples, it's important to know the approximate translations that English can have of verbs with prefixes. While there is no direct translation, it's possible to understand verbs with prefixes as prepositional verbs in English. The meaning of such verbs will not work 100% of the time, so the best way to learn them is by memorizing and connecting them to English verbs. For instance, schauen means to look, but with a prefix, anschauen can mean to look at or examine. In this case, it's possible to get a meaning of a preposition. Another verb is stehen, to stand, and with a prefix, we have aufstehen, to stand up or get up. However, not all verbs will be this way, like kommen, to come, and ankommen, to arrive. The two verbs have two meanings, so we just have to remember them. This is something to simply know about verbs with prefixes, so let's have some examples. Anfangen means to start or begin, and when expressed in a sentence, the prefix will be at the end. Ich fange mit der Arbeit an. I am starting the work. In this case, we have a translation of a simple English verb. A different example is mitkommen, to come along, and in a sentence, the prefix will be at the end. Kommst du mit? Are you coming along? In this case, we have a prepositional English verb. It's worth noting that the structure of a separable prefixed verb will separate in the present, even if there's only a verb, like ich stehe auf, I get up, which in this case visually makes sense in English. Inseparable prefixes don't separate when the verb is conjugated, and often such verbs have an abstract meaning. Common inseparable prefixes are be, imp, int, ge, mis, fer, and zer. When using these verbs in context, they will be conjugated normally, but the prefix will stay attached to the verb. An example is verstehen, to understand. It's a verb with an abstract meaning, so we can say ich verstehe dich nicht. I don't understand you. The prefix doesn't separate and stays as is. Another example is erzählen, to tell, which is abstract, and we can say erzählt eine Geschichte. He tells a story. The prefix doesn't separate and stays as is. Mixed prefixes will be separable or inseparable depending on their meaning. If the stress is on the prefix, it's separable, and if the stress is on the verb stem, it's inseparable. So, the pronunciation of the verbs will determine if the prefix will separate or not. One example is überfahren, which will have different meanings, depending on where the stress is. Überfahren, in general, means to run over, and the stress is on the stem, überfahren. So, the prefix will be inseparable, like in the phrase, überfährt eine Katze. He runs over a cat. However, when the prefix is separated and placed at the end, the meaning will change, like fährt den Fluss über. He drives across the river. When the stress is on the prefix, the entire meaning changes, so mixed verbs are something that you have to get a feel for and listen to, and memorizing them will immensely help in understanding when and how to use them. Aside from these verbs, other concepts need to be explained. For instance, when it comes to the past tense, the pattern for separable and inseparable verbs will be the same as in the present, but in the future tense, both separable and inseparable prefixes are attached, so it's something to know, like ich werde morgen aufstehen. I will get up tomorrow. This is due to the verb being used as an infinitive. Another concept is past participles, which will get extra letters. For instance, aufstehen means to stand up or get up, but when used as a past participle, German adds the letters ge between the prefix and the verb, like Ich bin aufgestanden. I have gotten up. Another example is mitkommen, to come along. When it's used as a past participle, ge goes between the prefix and the verb, like Ich bin mitgekommen. I have come along. This concept is true when it comes to separable prefixes, but when looking at inseparable ones, past participles will not have ge because such verbs are abstract. One example is verstehen, to understand, which, as a past participle, will look like this. Ich habe verstanden. I have understood. Another example is erzählen, to tell. Ich habe erzählt. I have told. Due to the stress on the verb stem, German doesn't add ge because it doesn't need to change the pronunciation. In short, a separable prefix separates as a participle and gets ge. An inseparable prefix stays attached as a participle and doesn't get it. Although participles are for a future video, I mentioned them here because they'll be easier to understand in the future. Still, a few more concepts should be known about verbs with prefixes. Mixed prefix verbs are tricky because their meaning can shift depending on whether the prefix is separable or inseparable. However, one pattern can be used to distinguish them. If a verb has a literal, directional meaning, it's usually separable, but if it's abstract, it's usually inseparable, so you have to get a feel for it. A different concept is prefixes that completely change the meaning, even when they're somewhat related, like setzen, to set. With prefixes, it will have completely different meanings. Absetzen, to remove or dismiss. Versetzen, to transfer. Besitzen, to occupy. A good tip is to memorize verb clusters, which can help expand vocabulary faster. A similar concept is verbs with identical forms but different prefixes, which create different meanings, like gehen, to go, vergehen, to pass time, angehen, to approach, aufgehen, to rise, kommen, to come, ankommen, to arrive, auskommen, to get along. A different concept is prefixes in sentence structures. While separable prefixes are at the end of a main clause, when it comes to a subordinate clause, the prefix is attached because the verb moves to the end. Ich glaube, dass mitkommt. Sagt, dass die Arbeit anfängt. Another concept is modal constructions. When using modal verbs, a separable verb remains whole and moves to the end in the infinitive form, like Ich will heute Abend ausgehen. Wir können den Fehler übersehen. One final concept is prefix verbs in the passive voice, where inseparable prefix verbs stay intact. Der Film wird verstanden. These are things to watch out for. Remember, stress placement matters because it can turn a verb from separable to inseparable. Prefix verbs can look similar but have completely different meanings, and mixed prefix verbs depend on stress and meaning. Some inseparable verbs defy logic and need to be memorized, while prefix verbs behave differently in main and subordinate clauses. Also, watch out for abstract and literal meanings of prefixes. Overall, this is how verbs with prefixes work in German.